It's time to meet Santiago Meza Lopez, one of the most mysterious and important figures in the narcotics business. The Mexican army raided his hideout and captured him while he was very drunk. And just a few days after, an armed faction of hitmen tried but failed to break him out of his cell. Wondering why this person seems so important to them? Well, you should know. Stay tuned with me as we dig deeper on Santiago Meza Lopez's rise and fall. Santiago Meza Lopez was the legendary El Pozolero, translated as the stew maker. To understand what a stew maker is, we need to know some context that comes in the form of the event that followed the fall of the Guadalajara cartel. In the late 1980s, Miguel Felix Gallardo was arrested, causing his cartel to split into three different factions, one of which was the incredibly notorious Arellano Felix cartel, and that was headed by the equally notorious Arellano brothers, Benjamin Arellano Felix and Ramon Arellano Felix. This dynamic duo controlled significant trading routes from Tijuana into Baja California, routes that the Sinaloa cartel also wanted. This rivalry became violent, resulted in kidnappings, assassinations, and every assault you can imagine. Thousands of people died, including those who are innocent, and cartels would just dump their bodies into the rivers, clogging up sewer systems and hanging them from the bridges. It was an ugly sight until one day no more bodies were found. For some, this would be considered a good thing, which means fewer bodies means fewer victims, right? Wrong. People were still going missing, which even rose to 30,000 every year from 1996 to the late 2000s. And the missing persons cases piled up. The authorities found themselves confronted by a big question: where were all the bodies? Santiago Meza Lopez was born in Sinaloa, Mexico in 1964. He was born into poverty like many Sinaloans, and he had 9 siblings, which made matters worse. This tough reality forced him to become independent from a very young age. By the time he was an adult, he became a mason and was so good at his job. The members of the newly formed Arellano Felix organization noticed his superb masonry work. They took Santiago to work for them as a mason at first, then took on more work tending to their horses. There were 2 things that stood out for Santiago at that time: his foot soldier mentality and his incredible work ethics. He carried his work so efficiently with loyalty and dedication. His bosses began to realize that he would be useful for more than just tending to the horses. They decided to bring him into the business and become a drug dealer for the Arellano Felix cartel. Soon enough, he was promoted to drug office keeper, supervising drug cartel depots within Tijuana, which was an incredibly dangerous job, but somehow Santiago managed it well. There had been thousands of deaths in a few months due to the conflict between Arellano Felix and their rival cartel, Sinaloa. Their dead bodies were scattered all over the city. As a result of this level of violence, the Mexican army and police were on high alert, and American law enforcement such as the DEA and FBI were paying attention. The cartels began to realize the urgency of their situation. They would be captured if they couldn't find an efficient method of disposing of the bodies. Thus, the Arellano brothers sought professional advice from mysterious foreign criminals who had experience vanishing bodies in 1996. Their advice was diabolically simple: turn the flesh into paste and grind the bones into dust instead of throwing them away. This Hollywood horror-inspired method of body disposal struck a chord with the Arellano brothers. It was ingenious, cost-effective, and would leave no DNA evidence that could be traced back to them. Trust is the only problem. With this simple yet sickening task, they needed someone they could trust, because it was going to be a long-term gig and there was a heaping pile of bodies begging to be disposed of. The Arellano brothers assigned drug lords Efrain Perez and Jorge Arellano Felix with the task of finding someone suitable, and the obvious choice at the time was Santiago Meza Lopez. So they arranged a little experiment. They called the man and invited Santiago as well, in a room that had a 200-liter cylindrical drum filled with a corrosive solution of caustic soda mixed in water and a couple of other chemicals. Santiago was ordered to drop a huge chunk of meat and stir it until it had completely dissolved. That was just the beginning. 6 months later, Santiago was called for a second experiment. The conditions were the same except for 2 things. 1. There was an audience of hitmen who would learn and work closely with Santiago. 2. Instead of a chunk of meat, the subject of their experiment was a dead victim. Santiago was instructed to undress the victim and cram the body into the 200-liter barrel of corrosive solution. They all watched as the liquid froth turned red. They left the body in the liquid overnight, and by the time they returned the next morning, what was left of the corpse was a gooey mess of organic sludge with some bone fragments sticking out where it had worked. Over the next 3 months, work began almost immediately. Santiago became head of the disposal division and was placed on a $600 a week retainer. This was his payment for making those corpses disappear. When business was good, Santiago got around 30 bodies per month, and those bodies were delivered at predetermined locations, whether by a call or the flash of headlights. He would know the exact spot to pick up the corpses he would dispose of. Santiago always ensured that he had the solution on hand. He invested a lot into barrels, bought enough latex gloves to last a year, and would also stock up gas masks that protected himself and his crew from the terrible fumes and stench that came from the liquefying bodies. Santiago burned and buried bone fragments, teeth, and nails left behind by stewing bodies after about 8 hours of dissolution. This is where Santiago earned the nickname El Pozolero. Pozolero means someone who makes pozole. Pozole is a Mexican stew made from hominy and meat with other ingredients for garnishing. And the process of stirring the bodies in this mixture looks and feels a lot like stirring a pot of pozole on fire. During the night, pickup trucks collected barrels of liquefied humans and tossed them down cliffs and canyons where no one could find them. Nevertheless, Santiago developed a more efficient drainage system as he gained experience in this macabre trade. Santiago was dutiful. Sometimes during this macabre routine, Santiago began working directly for the utterly ruthless Arellano Felix organization's Teodoro Garcia Cemental, also known as El Tío. El Tío's specialty was extortion and kidnapping, and most of his kidnapped victims often ended up in Santiago's barrels. So it made sense that Santiago answered to him. However, in 2008, more than 12 years after Santiago first started liquefying bodies for the Arellano brothers, El Tío had a huge fallout with the organization and switched sides to the Sinaloa Cartel. The master kidnapper who took Santiago with him began to work for El Chapo. Now Santiago was the chief stewmaker of the Sinaloa Cartel. This meant he would now be stewing his former colleagues, people he once worked for, and with a classic case of loyalty to the money and nothing else. For almost a decade, authorities had no idea who El Pozolero was. A kidnapping ring operated under El Tío was captured in 2005, and 2 of its members were questioned. They admitted to kidnapping and killing 3 people before handing them over to a head of a cleanup crew named El Pozolero. Santiago's identity was discovered through their testimony and detailed descriptions. He became a high-priority target in several countries. Eventually, he was placed as number 20 on the FBI's list of most wanted men. However, Santiago managed to evade the feds, and for 4 years until he slipped up in 2009. As Santiago, El Tío, and other members of the crew were partying in the Baja Seasons neighborhood, playing loud music with sex workers, someone nearly tipped the police, who immediately informed the Mexican army. Someone alerted El Tío, and he and 30 of his men fled before the soldiers could capture them. Santiago, on the other hand, was too drunk and too busy cooking seafood to notice his comrades fleeing. He was captured on January 25, 2009. He confessed to investigators that he had liquefied over 300 victims. He even broke down and wept, begging God for forgiveness and apologizing to the families of the victims he had stewed. As part of his drama, he said he was not a monster, he was not a killer or even a drug dealer. He was just a man doing a job to put food on the table. But no one was buying it. On one hand, the family of his victims revealed that Santiago had refused to cooperate with the police and refused to reveal the locations of the victims he liquefied. There was the issue of his claim that he had only liquefied 300 victims. Obviously, that was a lie. It was because of a place called the Chicken Coop, an area in the city of Maclavio, Rojas Baja, Mexico, where Santiago installed the drainage and poured his stewed victims. It was basically a graveyard for liquefied people. Santiago used that location for at least a year and a half until the Mexican army raided the place. However, they didn't find anything because they didn't know what to look for. 3 new graves were found in August 2017 with at least 7,000 human fragments and 2,000 teeth. And this was what confirmed the fears of the authorities. Santiago's body count was not 300. It was in the tens of thousands. Later on, 14 to 15,000 fragments of remains were subsequently found in another area that Santiago used to call La Galeria. Santiago Meza Lopez was sentenced to 10 years in prison for charges related to organized crime in 2012. Despite the fact that liquefied remains are still being found every other month and that Santiago has not denied the heinous crime, he has not been charged for stewing the corpses. The reason for the delay is quite obvious. The government has been implicated in protecting El Pozolero. He is due to be released this year after completing his 10-year sentence. His victims' families are crying out for justice. The remains of their loved ones are impossible to be found, but they are waiting for the time that El Pozolero will answer for the terrible crimes he has committed.